Imagine this. You wake up in the middle of the night. Your room, familiar yet cloaked in darkness, feels different, wrong, somehow. You try to open your eyes fully, but something is off. Your vision is split in two, with your left eye locked permanently to the farthest corner of the room, while your right eye stares fixedly at the opposite direction. Two conflicting images assault your mind, creating a surreal nightmare. But it's not just a dream. No, this is real. Welcome to the darkest hours of one man's life, a living hell where his mind and body were no longer his own. The video opens with these words, the tone calm, but laced with unease, the narrator's voice slow and deliberate. A faint, eerie sound hums in the background, like a subtle wind blowing through an empty house, accompanied by creaks as if someone, is nearby, watching. The screen flickers, showing glimpses of a room, a dimly lit bedside table, an old lamp casting long shadows, a clock ticking quietly on the wall. But as the camera pans, something strange happens. The image begins to split, one half showing the lamp perfectly still, while the other side distorts, a warped doorway fading in and out of focus. The story you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart, the narrator continues. It's the true account of a man who faced something far beyond the realm of logic or science. Something so terrifying, so bizarre, that he questions his sanity to this day. And the worst part, there's no waking up from this nightmare. Suddenly, a sharp thud echoes in the background, like something heavy being dropped. The screen cuts to black for a brief moment, then fades back in to show the room again, only now a subtle but eerie change has taken place. The shadows seem deeper, the ticking of the clock slower, and an unnatural stillness hangs in the air. As the narrator invites viewers to like, subscribe, and share the video with anyone fascinated by the supernatural, there's a pause, a momentary silence that feels like the calm before a storm. The camera zooms in slowly on the clock, now barely moving. Time seems to have slowed down, distorted, much like the protagonist's fractured perception. In the background, something stirs, just out of frame, hidden in the shadows, watching silently. Are you ready to hear his story? The screen fades to black again, the ticking of the clock echoing in the void. Be warned, once you begin, there's no turning back. The story begins in the dead of night, inside an old, crumbling house that feels forgotten by time. The house stands alone at the edge of a dense forest, its wooden exterior weathered and gray, sagging under the weight of years gone by. The trees surrounding it are tall and twisted, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. There's a suffocating stillness in the air, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind that rustles the leaves, like a quiet warning carried from the depths of the woods. The moon hangs high, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to stretch unnaturally across the overgrown yard, as if they're alive, inching ever closer to the house. Inside, the house is a labyrinth of darkened hallways and forgotten rooms. Dust blankets everything, and the air is thick with the scent of decay. The wooden floorboards creak with every step, groaning as if under the weight of invisible specters. The walls are lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, revealing the cold stone beneath. A large, broken mirror hangs at the end of one hallway, reflecting only darkness, as if it holds secrets no one is meant to see. The protagonist finds himself in a dimly lit room, his childhood bedroom, but something is wrong. The bed is exactly where it should be, pushed against the far wall under a cracked window, and the familiar desk sits untouched, but the atmosphere is heavy, oppressive. It's as if the room is watching him, waiting. The soft hum of electricity buzzes faintly in the background, coming from an old lamp perched on the nightstand. The light flickers, its glow weak and unsteady, casting long, wavering shadows that seem to move when he's not looking. He glances toward the window. Outside, the forest looms, but there's something off. The trees, though still, seem unnaturally close, their branches scraping gently against the glass, even though the wind outside is barely a whisper. A strange, low fog has settled at the tree line, swirling slowly, almost deliberately, as if it's alive. His eyes narrow as he tries to focus, but his vision starts to blur, splitting into two images, one showing the fog and the other, the reflection of the room. For a moment, it feels like both realities are merging, each equally unsettling. His heart begins to race. The protagonist's pulse quickens as he scans the room again, a sudden feeling of dread sinking into his chest. The silence around him is unnatural, as though the house itself is holding its breath. He tries to rationalize it. It's just an old house, filled with the usual creaks and groans of age, but there's an undeniable sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. He hears a faint rustling from down the hallway, like footsteps softly brushing against the floor. But when he strains to listen, the sound disappears, swallowed by the silence. He turns back to the room, his eyes locking onto the broken mirror across the hall. The reflection is faint, barely visible in the dim light, but something about it feels wrong. His breath catches in his throat as he steps closer, the floor creaking underfoot. The mirror reflects the room behind him, but there's a shadow in the corner, darker than the rest of the room, a shape that shouldn't be there. He whips around, but the corner is empty. Cold sweat begins to bead on his forehead as he slowly turns back to the mirror, his reflection staring back at him. Except, something is off. The reflection's eyes aren't aligned, just like his vision, staring in opposite directions, as if seeing something he can't. The house seems to close in around him, the walls almost breathing with a quiet, unseen life. The air grows colder, heavy with the promise of something sinister. The faint ticking of an unseen clock echoes through the house, each tick slower than the last, as if time itself is beginning to warp. Outside, the trees remain still, but the fog presses closer, wrapping around the house like a suffocating shroud. The protagonist stands frozen, trapped between two worlds, one in the mirror and one outside of it, both filled with an unknowable terror. It's in this moment that he realizes the house isn't just old and forgotten. It's waiting, watching, and whatever is inside it is awake. The night starts like any other, but as the protagonist sits alone in the eerie quiet of the house, something feels off. At first, it's subtle, like a whisper of unease creeping at the edges of his mind, easy to brush off as a trick of his imagination. The room is dimly lit by the flickering lamp on his nightstand, casting weak shadows across the floor. He shifts uneasily in his chair, glancing around, but everything appears just as it should. Yet, there's an underlying tension in the air, an invisible force that makes the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The first sign is almost imperceptible, a barely audible tap. He freezes, his breath caught in his throat, straining to listen. The sound comes again, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers gently drumming against a wooden surface. It's coming from the wall behind him. He turns slowly, eyes narrowing as he stares at the faded wallpaper. But there's nothing there. No source of the noise, no movement, just the cold, lifeless wall. He tells himself it's probably just the house settling, an old structure creaking in the night. But the tapping persists steady, deliberate, as though something, or someone, is trying to get his attention. He tries to ignore it, but his mind won't let him. The tapping grows louder, more insistent, now seeming to echo throughout the house, bouncing off the walls and floor. His heart begins to race, the steady rhythm of the taps syncing with the rapid thudding of his pulse. He stands, moving cautiously toward the wall, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the cold surface. The moment his fingers make contact, the tapping stops, leaving an eerie silence in its wake, more unsettling than the noise itself. Relief washes over him for a moment, but it's short-lived. The air in the room shifts, growing colder, heavy with a sense of impending dread. That's when he feels it, the sensation of being watched. His skin prickles with the unmistakable awareness that he's no longer alone. He whips his head around, scanning the room, but it's empty. Still, the feeling lingers, pressing down on him like a weight. It's as if there are eyes in the shadows, watching him, tracking his every move. Suddenly, the temperature drops sharply, and his breath fogs in the air. His heart pounds in his chest as he stumbles back from the wall, the floor creaking ominously beneath his feet. A low, almost imperceptible hum fills the room, a sound that vibrates in his bones, making him feel as if the very fabric of reality is beginning to warp. The shadows in the corners of the room seem to stretch, darkening, moving subtly, as though they're alive. He blinks, but the shadows remain, pulsing with a quiet, threatening energy. Then, without warning, the lamp flickers violently, the light sputtering in and out of existence. Each flicker reveals something more unsettling. A chair slightly out of place, a picture frame tilted just enough to be noticeable, small, almost imperceptible changes that make his stomach churn. The shadows seem to inch closer with every pulse of the light, creeping toward him like a slow, inevitable tide. His vision blurs again, splitting in two. The left side of the room seems to shift unnaturally, bending in on itself, while the right side stretches out endlessly. The dissonance between the two images makes his head spin, and he stumbles, reaching out blindly for something to steady himself. But his hand passes through empty air where the table should have been. Panic sets in as his sense of reality crumbles around him. The once familiar room now feels alien, distorted, as though he's trapped in a space that doesn't follow the rules of the real world. Then he hears it, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but unmistakable. A voice. It's faint, almost a whisper, barely audible over the hum that fills the room. He can't make out the words, but the tone sends a chill down his spine. It's coming from a hallway. His pulse quickens, and despite the overwhelming fear that grips him, he moves toward the door. The voice grows louder, more distinct, but still too muffled to understand. As he steps into the hallway, the temperature drops even further, his breath coming out in short, visible puffs. The voice stops. The silence is deafening, pressing in on him from all sides. His vision, still split, shows two different versions of the hallway, one dark and empty, the other shadowed and distorted. He's frozen in place, unsure of which direction is real, or if either of them is. His heart pounds in his chest, each beat echoing loudly in his ears, and for the first time, he wonders if he's truly alone in the house. That's when he sees it, a flicker of movement at the far end of the hallway. Something shifts in the darkness, a shadowy figure barely visible in the dim light. It's standing perfectly still, just out of reach, watching him. The figure doesn't move, doesn't speak, but its presence fills the space with a palpable sense of dread. His throat tightens, and his legs feel heavy, rooted to the spot. He wants to run, but he can't tear his eyes away from the shadow, now slowly beginning to take shape. And then, in the blink of an eye, it's gone, vanished into the black void of the hallway, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. But the feeling of being watched, that cold, suffocating presence, remains. The protagonist stands frozen, heart pounding in his chest, staring into the void of the hallway where the shadowy figure had just disappeared. His mind is racing, torn between two overpowering instincts: to flee this place, to run as fast and as far as his legs can carry him, or to investigate, to seek out the source of the strange occurrences and confront whatever is lurking in the shadows. He feels an overwhelming sense of dread creeping up his spine, a primal fear telling him to turn back, that he's in far too deep. But something else, perhaps curiosity or the need for answers, keeps him rooted in place. As he stands there, torn between retreating and pushing forward, the house seems to shift around him. The hallway, once familiar, now feels distorted, as though the walls are closing in, stretching impossibly long with each passing second. The oppressive silence is deafening, and his mind begins to play tricks on him. Is he imagining it? Is the house really changing? Or is it his mind unraveling under the weight of fear? His breath comes in shallow gasps, and he fights to steady himself, his vision still fractured. Two disjointed realities overlapping in a way that makes him question everything. Then, From the depths of the hallway, the voice returns. It's faint, barely more than a whisper, but there's no mistaking it. Someone, or something, is calling out to him. The words are indistinct, like a distant murmur carried on the wind, but the tone is unmistakably eerie, filled with an unnatural cadence that makes his skin crawl. The voice seems to beckon him forward, drawing him toward the darkened end of the hallway where the figure had stood moments before. His pulse quickens, and despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, he finds himself taking a hesitant step forward. His mind races with questions. What if he doesn't go? What if this presence, whatever it is, won't stop until it has him? Will he ever be able to escape the house if he doesn't confront it? And worse still, what if he's already too late? If something beyond his comprehension has already begun to warp his reality? The sense of helplessness weighs heavily on him, his heart racing with the knowledge that no choice feels safe, but doing nothing might be even more dangerous. With trembling hands, he reaches for his phone, desperate for a lifeline to the outside world. But the screen remains dark, dead. The house has cut him off, isolating him from anyone who could help. Panic begins to rise in his throat, but he swallows it down, forcing himself to focus. He has to make a decision. He knows he can't stay here, frozen in indecision, trapped by fear. The voice grows louder, more insistent, and he feels the weight of it pressing against his mind, a subtle force pushing him to move. He takes another step forward, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath him. His footsteps feel heavy, each one echoing through the silent hallway, as if the house itself is listening, waiting. The further he goes, the colder the air becomes, until the chill bites at his skin, making his breath come out in visible puffs. His vision continues to warp. One side of the hallway stretches endlessly, while the other seems to fold in on itself, creating an impossible, disorienting landscape. He stops again, fear clawing at his chest, but he knows he has to press on. The voice calls to him again, louder this time, as though it's right behind him, whispering into his ear. His blood runs cold, and he spins around, but the hallway behind him is empty. Still, the sense of being watched clings to him like a second skin, an oppressive weight that makes his every movement feel sluggish, deliberate. Whatever is here, it's not going to let him go so easily. His thoughts race, grappling with the impossible. Should he turn back, try to flee the house, even though something tells him that once he crossed the threshold, he had already sealed his fate? Or should he confront the darkness head-on, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there are answers waiting for him in the shadows? His body screams for him to leave, to escape the nightmare before it consumes him completely. But his mind fixates on the voice, on the strange pull it has over him. What if the only way out is through? The decision is torturous, every fiber of his being torn between fear and the desperate need for resolution. His heart pounds in his ears, the cold air stinging his lungs as he forces himself to move. He steps forward, slowly, cautiously, toward the place where the voice seems to emanate, each step taking him deeper into the house's clutches. The walls seem to close in on him, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive, as if they're alive, waiting to swallow him whole. His breath comes out in shallow gasps, the oppressive weight of dread almost suffocating him. Finally, he reaches the end of the hallway, where the darkness is thick, almost tangible, like a curtain he must pass through. He hesitates for just a moment, his entire body screaming at him to turn back. But he knows it's too late. He's come this far. There's no turning back now. With one last breath, he steps into the darkness, fully aware that whatever happens next could change him forever. As the protagonist steps into the thick darkness at the end of the hallway, the temperature plummets. The air becomes icy, pressing against his skin like cold, invisible hands. For a moment, he's completely blind. His vision, already distorted, is now consumed by the overwhelming blackness. He feels a profound sense of isolation, as though he's crossed a threshold into a different reality, one where the rules of a natural world no longer apply. The silence is suffocating, as if the house itself is holding its breath, waiting. Then, suddenly, the darkness shifts. A faint, flickering light appears in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows along the walls. His heart pounds in his chest as he cautiously moves toward it, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee. But his legs keep moving, as if pulled by an unseen force. The air grows thick, heavy with a sense of malevolence, like something ancient and dark is watching him from just beyond the edge of his perception. He feels it, a presence lurking in the shadows, following his every move. As he approaches the source of the light, he realizes it's coming from an old, rusted lantern, swaying gently from a hook on the ceiling. The light casts strange, elongated shadows on the walls, distorting the room around him. But it's not the light that sends a chill down his spine. It's what's standing just beyond it. There, barely visible in the flickering glow, is the figure, the same shadowy form he glimpsed at the end of the hallway. Only now, it's clearer, more defined. The figure stands completely still, shrouded in darkness, its face obscured by the shadows. It's tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin, hanging limply at its sides. There's something profoundly wrong about it. Something in the way it holds itself, the way it seems to blend with the shadows, as though it's part of the darkness itself. His breath catches in his throat as he stares at the figure, frozen in place by a terror so intense it feels like his heart might stop at any moment. He tries to speak, to ask who or what it is, but his voice dies in his throat. The figure doesn't move, doesn't speak, but he can feel its gaze locked on him, piercing through the darkness, straight into his soul. The room seems to pulse with a quiet, sinister energy, and the shadows around him begin to shift, swirling slowly as if alive, creeping closer with each passing second. The temperature drops even further, until the cold feels like needles pricking his skin. Without warning, the figure takes a step forward. The movement is slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying. Its footfalls make no sound, but the air around it seems to ripple, distorting the space in a way that makes reality feel fragile, like a delicate illusion that could shatter at any moment. The closer it gets, the heavier the atmosphere becomes, pressing down on him, suffocating him with an unseen weight. His legs feel weak, but he's rooted to the spot, unable to move, trapped in the pull of this supernatural force. The figure stops just a few feet away, and for the first time, the protagonist sees its face, if it can even be called that. The features are twisted, grotesque, as though its skin has been stretched too tightly over its bones. Its eyes are hollow, empty voids that seem to suck in the light around them, and its mouth is a gaping, black maw, devoid of teeth, but filled with an unnatural darkness that makes his stomach churn. The figure doesn't blink, doesn't move, but its presence is overwhelming, filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. Then, in the silence, it speaks. The voice is not human. It's low, guttural, like the sound of stones grinding together, and it reverberates through the air, shaking the very foundation of the room. The words are unclear, a strange language he doesn't recognize, but the meaning is unmistakable. It's a warning, a threat. The figure takes another step forward, and the protagonist feels the temperature drop to freezing. His breath comes in short, sharp gasps, the cold air burning his lungs. He's never felt fear like this before, a primal terror that grips his soul and refuses to let go. Desperation overtakes him, and he stumbles backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. The shadows on the walls seem to come alive, writhing and twisting like tendrils of darkness, reaching out toward him. He scrambles to escape, his hands shaking as he fumbles for the door, but it slams shut with a deafening bang. The house is alive, and has no intention of letting him go. The figure moves closer, its empty eyes locked onto his, and he feels a wave of nausea wash over him. It's as though the figure is feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing second. His vision begins to blur again, the room spinning around him, and he knows he's running out of time. The air is thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seem to close in, suffocating him in their embrace. Finally, In a last desperate act, he lunges toward the lantern, grabbing it with trembling hands. The light flickers violently as he swings it toward the figure, hoping, praying, that the light will drive it back. For a moment, the figure hesitates, its form flickering like a shadow caught in the wind. But then, it moves forward again, undeterred, and the lantern's light dims, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The figure is upon him now, towering over him, its cold breath washing over his skin. The shadows swirl around them, wrapping tightly around his body, pulling him into the abyss. He tries to scream, but no sound comes out. The figure leans in closer, its hollow eyes staring deep into his soul, and in that moment, he knows there's no escaping this. The supernatural force has claimed him, and whatever happens next, he won't survive. As the figure looms over him, the protagonist's world spirals into a claustrophobic nightmare. The shadows that have enveloped him grow thicker, almost tangible, like a dark fog that clings to his skin, pulling him deeper into the cold void. His body is paralyzed, muscles locked in place by an invisible force. He can feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, each thud more frantic than the last, as though his very life is slipping away with every beat. The figure's face is now inches from his own, its empty, hollow eyes staring directly into his soul. It's not just looking at him, it's inside him, probing his thoughts, his memories, and every dark corner of his mind. And then it speaks again, its voice a low, guttural growl that seems to resonate in his bones. The words are clearer now, though still in that strange, ancient language. But somehow, the meaning begins to crystallize in his mind. The figure is telling him something. It's showing him why this is happening. Images flood his mind in a chaotic, nightmarish sequence. Flashes of forgotten history, ancient rituals performed in this very house, blood sacrifices, and a curse that has lingered in the walls for centuries. The figure is not just a ghost or a demon. It's something far older, something that has been waiting, biding its time, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who have lived here before. The protagonist's mind reels as the truth slams into him. The house itself is alive, a vessel for this ancient, malevolent force that has been trapped here for generations. And now, it has found him. The figure was once human, an unfortunate soul who tried to harness the dark power of the house, but was consumed by it instead. It became part of the shadows, its humanity stripped away, leaving behind only a twisted, corrupted being. The figure's message is clear. The same fate awaits him. The shadows tighten around his body, constricting him, making it harder to breathe. His lungs burn with the effort, and a cold sweat breaks out on his skin. He tries to scream, to call for help, but the words die in his throat, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. He's trapped, and the house is feeding on his terror, growing stronger with every moment he remains within its grasp. But then, a small flicker of resistance stirs deep inside him. He remembers the lantern, the light. His mind races, grasping at the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there's a way to fight back. The light from the lantern had momentarily weakened the figure, hadn't it? Could it be the key to his survival? With all the strength he can muster, he forces his body to move, his trembling hand reaching for the lantern that lies just out of reach. The figure senses his intent and lunges forward, its grotesque face twisted into something resembling a snarl. The shadows around him pulse violently, as if the house itself is trying to stop him. But the lantern is within his grasp, and with a final, desperate effort, he grabs it. The light flickers weakly in the cold air, but it's enough. The figure recoils, its form rippling, as if caught in a violent wind. The shadows pull back slightly, and for the first time, the protagonist feels the faintest glimmer of hope. He raises the lantern higher, the light growing stronger, pushing the darkness away. The figure lets out a guttural, inhuman scream, a sound that reverberates through the walls of the house, shaking the very foundation. The air is filled with the scent of decay, of something ancient being disturbed, and the walls seem to pulse in response. The house is fighting back, resisting his attempts to break free, but he pushes forward, his every movement slow and agonizing, as if he's wading through a thick, suffocating fog. The shadows writhe around him, twisting and turning, but the light holds them at bay. Step by step, he inches toward the doorway, his body trembling from the exertion. The figure, once looming and powerful, now appears diminished, flickering like a shadow on the verge of disappearing. Just as he reaches the doorway, the figure speaks again, its voice weak, but filled with an ominous finality. "You cannot escape," it growls, the words slithering into his mind like a venomous whisper. "You are already part of this place. It will never let you go." For a moment, his resolve falters. What if the figure is right? What if, no matter how far he runs, the house will always find him? The thought sends a chill through his body, and he hesitates, standing on the threshold of the room, the light of the lantern flickering wildly in his trembling hand. But then he remembers. The figure had said the same thing to its previous victims, and yet, here he is, still alive. He has to believe there's a way out. Summoning every ounce of strength he has left, he steps through the doorway, into the hallway. The air feels different out here, less oppressive, but the house is still alive, still watching, waiting for him to falter. The figure lets out one final, ear-piercing scream as the lantern's light burns brighter, filling the hallway with an otherworldly glow. The shadows retreat, hissing as they slither back into the corners of the house, and the figure vanishes, swallowed by the darkness it once commanded. For a brief moment, silence fills the house. The only sound is his own ragged breathing as he stands in the hallway, lantern in hand, trembling from the ordeal. The oppressive weight in the air has lifted, but the house feels different now, weaker, as if the malevolent force that once controlled it has been banished, at least for now. But deep down, he knows the truth. The house is still alive, still hungry. The curse hasn't been lifted. It's simply waiting, biding its time until the next unfortunate soul crosses its threshold. The protagonist stumbles out of the dark hallway, his legs barely supporting his weight as he gasps for air. Every inch of his body feels battered and bruised, his muscles aching as if they had been stretched to their limit. The lantern in his hand flickers, casting weak, trembling light across the dilapidated house. For a moment, the house is still, as though it, too, is catching its breath. But the shadows that cling to the corners feel alive, pulsating with a quiet, sinister energy, waiting for their chance to strike again. The protagonist knows that his escape is temporary. Whatever he has just faced isn't gone. It's lurking, hidden in the walls, watching him waiting. He makes his way toward the front door, each step heavy with the knowledge that he might not make out. The floorboards creak beneath his weight, the house groaning as though it's aware of his intentions. Every breath feels labored, the cold air burning his lungs as he stumbles through the dimly lit rooms. He reaches out for the doorknob with trembling fingers, but a sudden surge of fear washes over him. What if opening that door doesn't free him? What if the curse extends beyond these walls, following him wherever he goes? His hand hesitates on the doorknob, a thousand thoughts racing through his mind. The figure's final words echo in his head, cold and menacing. "You cannot escape. You're already part of this place." The house feels alive around him, the weight of its ancient malevolence pressing down on him. Could it really be true? Is he forever bound to this place, trapped in its dark web, no matter where he runs? His heart pounds in his chest, and for a brief moment, he considers staying, succumbing to the inevitable. But then, a faint sound reaches his ears, barely audible above the oppressive silence. It's the distant chirping of crickets, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, sounds of the outside world, of freedom. It snaps him out of his paralysis. He can't stay here. He won't. With a final, desperate push, he twists the doorknob and throws the door open. The cold night air hits him like a wave, sharp and biting, but it's a relief. He stumbles out onto the overgrown porch, the lantern flickering and sputtering in his hand. For the first time since the nightmare began, He breathes in deeply, the fresh air filling his lungs. The oppressive weight that had been suffocating him inside the house seems to lift slightly, but it doesn't disappear. It lingers, a constant reminder that the house is still watching, still waiting. He glances back at the house, its dark, broken windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. The structure seems to loom over him, as if it's leaning forward, daring him to leave. The lantern's light dims further, and the shadows in the windows seem to shift, twisting and writhing as though alive. His breath catches in his throat, but he forces himself to turn away. He can't look at it any longer. He has to get as far away as possible. As he moves down the porch steps, his legs nearly give out beneath him, but he pushes forward, driven by sheer willpower. The fog that had settled around the house earlier is still there, thick and swirling like a living entity, but it no longer feels suffocating. Instead, it seems to part as he walks through it, like something allowing him to pass. But he knows better than to feel relieved. The house may have let him go, for now, but he can feel its presence in the back of his mind, a dark, festering thing that won't ever truly leave him. He reaches the edge of the property, the thick trees and underbrush surrounding the house like a barrier. The woods are eerily quiet, as if the creatures within them are holding their breath, watching him. His body is shaking from both the cold and the lingering fear, but he doesn't stop moving. He's almost free, almost. But just as he takes his final step out of the yard, something stops him in his tracks. It's faint at first, barely noticeable, but it's there. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the house. He turns, his heart hammering in his chest, and looks back toward the front door. It's open, just as he left it, but there's something wrong. The shadows within the house seem thicker now, darker, and they shift unnaturally, twisting like a mass of writhing serpents. Then, from the depths of the house, a figure emerges. The same figure that had haunted him inside, its grotesque face partially obscured by the shadows, its hollow eyes locked onto him. But this time, it doesn't stop at the doorway. It steps out onto the porch, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it's testing the boundaries of the curse. The lantern in his hand sputters one last time before going out completely, plunging him into darkness. The figure stands at the edge of the porch, its twisted form barely visible in the moonlight. The shadows around it pulse, alive with an unnatural energy, and the air grows cold once more. The protagonist feels a deep, primal terror rise within him, but he knows there's nothing more he can do. The house hasn't let him go. Not fully. It's letting him leave, but it will follow. No matter where he goes, no matter how far he runs, the shadows will always be there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. With one last glance at the figure, he turns and walks into the woods, his steps slow and uncertain. The further he goes, the more the sounds of the forest return, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, but none of it brings him comfort. The figure's presence weighs heavily on him, its dark gaze burning into his back as he disappears into the night. He knows he has escaped the house, but he also knows the truth. The terror hasn't ended. It's only just begun. As he vanishes into the shadows of the forest, the house remains, standing tall and silent, waiting for its next victim. The door swings shut with a soft creak, and the shadows inside ripple once more, as though something is stirring. The house may seem still and empty, but it's always watching, always waiting, because no one ever truly leaves. Not really. The screen fades to black as the narrator's voice returns, calm yet chilling. Some places are alive, waiting, watching, and feeding off the souls of those who dare enter. And sometimes, the terror follows you home. The video ends with a final call to action, urging viewers to subscribe, share their thoughts, and prepare for the next terrifying tale that awaits. Days pass, but the events of that night linger like a shadow over the protagonist's life, creeping into every corner of his thoughts. At first, he tries to convince himself it's over. He tells himself that he escaped, that the house is behind him, but deep down, he knows better. The house may be miles away, abandoned in the dark forest, but its presence still clings to him. It's not something he can shake off. It's woven into his very being, like a stain that will never fade. At night, when the world is quiet and the shadows stretch long across his bedroom, he feels it, watching. The first sign that the house hasn't truly let go is subtle, almost easy to dismiss. It happens when he's getting ready for bed. He's brushing his teeth, staring blankly into the bathroom mirror, when, for just a split second, he sees something in the reflection, a shadow that doesn't belong, standing in the doorway behind him. His heart skips a beat, and he whips around, but there's nothing there. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit and perfectly still. He shakes it off, chalking it up to his overactive imagination, a lingering effect of the trauma. But he knows, deep down, it wasn't just his mind playing tricks. The next few days are filled with more of these fleeting moments. A movement in the corner of his eye, a shadow shifting where there shouldn't be one, and that unmistakable feeling of being watched. At first, it's easy enough to ignore. He throws himself into his routine, trying to stay busy, to distract himself. But the more he tries to outrun it, the more persistent the feeling becomes. It's as if the shadows are following him, creeping closer with every passing day. One night, as he's lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, the temperature in the room suddenly drops. He pulls the blankets tighter around himself, trying to ignore the cold, but it's unlike anything he's felt before. It's the same bone-chilling cold from the house, the kind that seeps into your skin and freezes your breath in your lungs. His eyes snap open, heart racing, and that's when he hears it, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. They're coming from just outside his bedroom door, slow and deliberate, like someone or something is pacing back and forth in the hallway. His breath catches in his throat, and he lies there, frozen, too terrified to move. The footsteps continue, each one sending a jolt of fear through his body. He knows what is. He knows it's the figure from the house, the one that never left. The house let him leave, but the figure followed, bringing its curse with it. He squeezes his eyes shut, hoping that if he stays still, if he doesn't acknowledge it, maybe it will go away. But the footsteps stop, and the silence that follows is even worse. The air grows thick, heavy with dread, and he can feel it. Something is standing just outside his door waiting. For what feels like an eternity, he lies there, heart pounding in his chest, until finally the temperature begins to rise. The oppressive weight lifts, and the room returns to its normal state. But the fear doesn't leave him. He knows now, without a doubt, that the house's influence is still with him, and it's not going to stop. He's marked, tied to the shadows, forever linked to the malevolent force that resides in that cursed place. In the days that follow, his life begins to unravel. The once fleeting moments of terror become more frequent, more pronounced. He starts seeing the figure everywhere, in his reflection, in the windows at night, in the dark corners of his home. It never shows itself fully, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting. His sleep becomes restless, plagued by nightmares of the house and the figure that haunts him. Each night, he dreams of walking through those cursed halls, hearing the whispers of the dead and feeling the cold touch of the shadows wrapping around him, pulling him back. One evening, as he sits alone in his living room, the lights flicker, just like they did in the house. The air grows cold again, and the familiar dread washes over him. He knows what's coming, but this time, he doesn't try to fight it. He stands up, heart racing, and turns toward the darkened hallway where the shadows are already shifting. The figure is there, waiting, just like before. But now, it feels more real, more tangible, like it's crossing over into his world. The figure takes a step forward, and his breath catches in his throat. He feels the same overwhelming terror he did in the house, but this time, there's no lantern to save him, no escape. The figure moves closer, its twisted, grotesque form barely visible in the dim light. He stumbles back, his legs weak with fear, but he knows it's futile. The The house never let him go. It simply followed him, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to reclaim him. As the figure looms over him, the room grows darker, the light fading until all that's left is the suffocating blackness. The shadows wrap around him, pulling him down into the abyss. He tries to scream, but no sound escapes his throat. The figure's hollow eyes stare into his soul, and in that moment, he realizes the horrifying truth. He never truly left the house. He's been living in its shadow ever since, and now, it's come to claim him once and for all. The screen fades to black, and the narrator's voice returns, cold and unsettling. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The house is always waiting, watching, and once it has you in its grip, it never lets go. And sometimes, it follows you home. The video ends with a lingering shot of the house, dark and foreboding, as the shadows in the windows twist and writhe like living things. The call to action is subtle but chilling. Share your thoughts in the comments if you dare. And remember, the darkness is always closer than you think.